Hi, Vincent Hall. Welcome to another episode of the Photography Lessons for Everyone. Today we're going to talk a little bit about taking pictures of simple objects and making them get more importance. We were talking last week a little bit about hierarchy, and if you remember, I was using my cat as an example of by shooting up at a higher angle and isolating her face, it gave her more importance. We can do that with little objects we have around the home because the weather hasn't been too cooperative lately. And I looked at the weather for this week in McLean and it's rainy 3 out of the last 5 days. So you might want to stay indoors, or sometimes maybe just don't feel like doing outside nature photography every single lesson. And I can understand that too. I enjoy doing portrait photography myself, but finding willing subjects right now from 6 feet away or more is a challenge. So we're going to move to some still life ideas. You can set up your own still life display for photographing pretty easily. All you're going to need is some white paper and some black paper. And if you don't have black paper, then don't worry about it. Just use white. White's fine too. I will show you the difference, however. White reflects light and black absorbs. So for example, here's white. If you watch the shadow under my chin and I do this, voila, chin gone. If any of you ever watched the Ellen DeGeneres show, she has a whiteboard light like this underneath her desk to make her eyes look glowy and not have any dark circles. And that's why even at age almost 63, she looks like she's 30. And it's all good because of white light. Now, nobody wants to walk around doing this, but you can see what just happened. Every shadow on my face pretty much disappeared because white is reflecting the light around it. And if I have a white ceiling, which I do, it's going to reflect it. So it's going to minimize the shadows. Now that's great if you're doing photography of a person and they don't want to have any dark shadows on their face. But for still life objects, we might want to have a little more definition. So we can try black. Black paper does the exact opposite of white, and it's going to add shadows. So suddenly, oh God help us, I have more shadows on my face than I even wanted to, but it's going to at least give you the idea of definition and give some interest because we're getting some depth on my face. So that's what black and white can do for taking pictures of objects. So cool trick. If somebody wants to take a self-portrait of you, or you want to do your own selfie and you're holding your camera, find a sheet of white paper and just later on, you can crop it in your phone and just do this or whatever, and it'll brighten up your face. It's like an instant glow. So that's just a side trick if you want to try that later at home. But right now we're going to get started doing some still life photography using our phone or our camera, whatever you might have. Doing a lot of something called cropping through the lens. That means zooming in, zooming out, whatever you need to do to just get that area that you want photographed without all kinds of extra stuff around it. Because I'm at my kitchen table and there's all kinds of stuff to the left, to the right, and in front of me that I don't want in my picture. But let's get started and I'll show you how this works. Natural light is always best. So you might want to find a door or window that you can sit next to, but if not, we can always correct the tones in Photoshop later on when we're down in the photo studio. What I did here was I just have 2 pieces of cardboard and something to back up. I'm using a little candle holder just to hold this up. So what I want are just these 2 pieces of poster board to line up so that they are perpendicular to each other, almost like an open book. And as long as we have something like that, we have our background and we have our base. And this base is going to help reflect light and we'll be able to crop out the other areas. Later, I'm going to be propping just the black paper on top of the white poster board so I can get my black background, which will be very similar to what we're talking about. I know this is really boring, just staring at a blank white wall, so let's get started with the image. For our first demonstration with this still life, I've selected something pretty simple. 3 tomatoes and a plate. I selected a blue plate because I like the play of the reddish orange tomatoes against the blue plate. Almost complementary colors, not quite, but still warm and cool. So that works. Also, I am arranging, I can move this around to get a more interesting angle. It doesn't have to be flat on. I'm kind of liking this a little bit better. Moving it back a little bit will at least eliminate this seam that I'll get rid of in Photoshop later. I'm just going to scooch it over a little bit more. Once I have the camera where I want it, I just simply take the photo. And if I want to move up a little higher, I can try some looking down views on these tomatoes and get a whole different sense of composition and lighting. You can see these little highlights here, which are interesting, and every time I move them around, it changes. So don't be afraid to play around with where you put things. You could even prop this up or something, whatever you might want to do. You notice by having the white behind it, we're getting some interesting white rim light here. That's called rim light, and it's the light reflecting from behind the subject matter. When you take portraits, a lot of people like rim light because it gives them a nice aura around the edge of their hair and also softens any dark shadows. What we can do next is take the black paper and put it behind this, and that's going to change the whole tenor of this picture. I no longer have rim light. Now it's absorbing the shadows. This black turned into kind of like a grayish tone because, again, it is reflecting sunlight from outdoors and it's just a piece of construction paper. You'll be amazed in Photoshop how we can get that black to be a really dark, rich black. So just by the idea of changing one color in the background, this changes the whole idea of my still life. I'm going to switch it out here and I'll be right back with the black on the bottom as well. All right, I've changed my background now to being black on the bottom as well as the top. And you can see that changes the dynamic of the plate. It gives a little more shadow. The tomatoes have more vibrance almost now because they're against this darker background. And if you're wondering why my background on the top just got lighter suddenly, it's because the sun just came out with a vengeance where I was sitting at a doorway that had a cloud. So your light might change, and sometimes that works for the better and sometimes not. But the idea is you can take just some simple things at home, like some fruit, some vegetables, maybe put them on a plate and create a still life. Again, I'll try moving down. We could go over top. That's kind of fun too. You get a whole different sense of perspective with this. And I really do like the straight on aerial views. Looking down. You can do this with a cell phone pretty easily because you can see where you're going with it. You could also think of moving in, moving out. Last week we did looking up, so here's more of a looking up idea. That really changes everything too. So again, those are some ideas that you might want to do with just a simple object. Let's try something else. Here's some real azaleas that I just trimmed a piece off from the bush in my front yard. You may be getting tired of seeing my azaleas, but they're still in full bloom and I thought they'd be interesting. You could use silk flowers or plastic flowers or whatever you might have at home too. But again, by putting them on this background, it might make an interesting photo. So you're saying, well, that's great, but I'm seeing all this stuff over here. I am too, and I don't like it much. But if I zoom in just a little bit, you can see that now I've got some nice photos, and we'll get rid of that seam in Photoshop behind them of the flowers, or maybe just a piece of the flower coming along this way without worrying about getting the whole image. It can be a really beautiful way to elevate the importance of just a simple object. Last week when we did these azaleas and I shot the entire bush, it was hard to appreciate the symmetry and patterns of one of the flowers. If we get in close, almost a macro zoom here, you can see all of the different tones and textures, and it makes that one petal of that flower look very interesting. So again, that's one way to just use something else. And what I like about this is that it has vertical as well as horizontal interest. So whereas the tomatoes were just kind of flat on the bottom, this one comes up into the vertical part of your background as well. I wanted to show you the difference that two colors could make. The flowers on the black, the greens take on a much more vibrant hue than they did on the white. And the kind of fuchsia red of the flowers also changes tone too. So when you shoot something, I think it would be a good idea to do each object with two different backgrounds, one black and one white, or gray or whatever color you might happen to have. It'll really give you a different effect, and it's something worth experimenting with. This is an old box, a little tin box that I saved from my grandfather's basement years ago. I always liked how they did the embossing of the names on top of the business and where it came from. And this one actually says Manufacturing of America, which isn't something we see too often these days. So that's something in and of itself. But just a box sitting there, it's not that exciting visually. However, this box has stuff inside. It has pen nibs and a couple different pieces of metal that I'm really not sure what they were used for, but they're interesting nonetheless. So if you just take, this could be jewelry, whatever you might happen to have, but just dump some out, maybe prop up the back of it, bring in the lid again, and we've got a cool still life right here. This could be on the black or the white. I chose the black just because I didn't want to make it look too stark. And a lot of times when metal hits highlights against white, you're going to lose some definition. So you might want to keep it like that. But it's fun to just play around with stuff you might have in a box. And again, jewelry is always a fine example of something like that. I actually really kind of like this still life. This might be something I would play around with in Photoshop for myself. Another idea is to take unrelated objects and group them together. In this one, I added another tin box that I collected back with that old gray metal box that I had shown you, and I reintroduced the azalea plant. You could lie it on here so that they are all touching and related, or this could simply be lying in front of these objects somehow, depending on how you might want to arrange them. And that might give you an interesting thing to think about too, playing around with adding different objects. Maybe you have a collection of items. I like these little metal cans. There's another one. I could think about adding a third one in and making an interesting arrangement this way. There's so many ways to play around with this. Cans out of the image, cans in the image, lying them down, opening a box up maybe. Ideas are endless. And things that don't relate can relate just by virtue of placement. So I've moved these things around. They don't relate by subject matter, but they're all together in a group, so they do relate by placement. That's another way to approach a still life. Of course, nothing says unusual like comparing objects that have nothing in common. These are zero related. It's a bunch of grapes and a camel bell. But I love the idea of the shapes and the roundness on the top of that bell and the roundness of the grapes. And it's really simple, and we've got some beautiful shadows. And these can be interesting and fun. The unexpected is what will make your photographs pop. It's what makes people look at them a second time, because it's not what somebody sees every single day. We sure as heck don't see a lot of cowbells and grapes standing around anywhere. And again, changing the angle a little bit, that way, changing it this way. You can even come on an angle somewhat to the side, just being careful not to lose that edge. I just lost it there, but right about here. And again, beautiful shading, some really interesting still life effects. These are so much fun to do, and they really don't take a lot of time or effort, just some things you might have lying around the house. So there's some ideas, Vincent Hall photographers. You can try any objects you have around your home. Books, stacks of books set up. You can try taking books and candles, kind of coming up with that Renaissance painting type idea. You can get inspiration from paintings as well, now that I think of it. Lots of still life ideas. 19th century American realists did a lot of work with still lifes. Some of them were a little macabre. They would add things like dead animal parts and like whole fish that were filleted and set up for eating, but they made for interesting paintings. They make even better photography because it doesn't take as long and nobody wants to sit around smelling stinky objects. But anyway, the idea is enjoy this and have fun. You don't have to go outside for this assignment, but if you want to, you sure can. Paper is portable. You can bring it on outside, set it up, get some interesting highlights or reflections, shadows, whatever you might want to do, depending on if it's white or black paper. I think as for me, I might be walking around like this all day. It kind of makes me feel a little better on a gloomy day to have a bright outlook. Anyway, I look forward to seeing you all next week. I hope you have fun with this assignment. Experiment, be creative, but most of all, stay safe. And I'll see you next week.